Hello, thank you for the opportunity to join the committee this morning sorry, let me start. I don't know if it's going to be morning or afternoon, sorry.
No problem. Yep, you can restart, no problem. And then we'll do 3.
Hello.
Sorry, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to join the team this morning to discuss women's cardiovascular research, progress, pitfalls, and promise. I appreciate the opportunity to present with you today. These are my disclosures. I'm founder and chief scientific officer of AccuHealth Technologies, a technology startup from Morehouse School of Medicine. Much of the research that I'll share in my discussion today is funded by the National Institutes of Health and the National Center for Advancing Translational Science. Our educational objectives like to be able to outline barriers to participation of African Americans and women in clinical trials, introduce lack of cultural congruent communication as a key barrier, describe the Association of Black Cardiologists Cardiovascular Implementation Study, known as CVIS, as an innovative approach to address participation of clinical trials. Highlight the Georgia Improved Perinatal Care Research and Intervention Network, or PCRIN, to address maternal mortality and promote health equity. It is important to recognize that there are FDA statements as well as NIH that focus on participation of African Americans and women in clinical trials. For example, according to the FDA, as you can see with the reference there, clinical trials should include participants from across the demographic spectrum. In fact, the FDA Commissioner, Margaret Humberg, in August 2014, stated that a guiding principle of the FDA's goal to meet the health needs of patients across the demographic spectrum is the importance of diversity in clinical trials. Furthermore, there is an FDA Safety and Innovation Act of FDASIA of 2012, which includes a requirement to study the availability of data on the participation of demographic subgroups such as sex, age, race, and ethnicity in clinical trials. Similarly, the NIH has similar requirements as well. However, it is important to note that there are no mandates. The data gets collected, and at the end of the day, if the trial does not include the requisite number, the data will be published and available for people to go look at if they're interested, but it does not mean the product will not be approved. This is quite important as we think about how to address some of the disparities. What are some of the barriers to clinical trial participation? They include patient-related barriers, provider-related barriers, and barriers that are related to either the practice and the community. For patient barriers, we've heard about the mistrust of the provider health system, as well as the provider, the health system, or the research team, lack of information, fear or harm of side effects, complexity of protocols, health-related factors, and as well as comorbidities in the patients or participants, actually not being asked to participate, and of course, sometimes a provider or researcher attitude to the overall opportunity to engage the patients. There are also provider barriers, most importantly, especially for independent practitioners, lack of infrastructure in the practice, lack of training knowledge, not familiar with the investigators, afraid of losing their patients, time away from practice, poor communication by the research team. Community barriers are available as well, or a potential problem, and those barriers include lack of information or readiness of community leaders, and importantly, cultural incompetence or lack of sensitivity of researchers to minority community needs. So all of these barriers mean whatever we're looking at as potential solutions, we need to think about it from a multi-layer standpoint and think about how we address all of these barriers. Importantly, on this slide, you can see that the clinical trial enterprise is an extensive workforce. Of course, at the top of the pyramid, if you will, you have the researchers at the academic health centers, the methodologists. These are the folks who design the clinical research studies, especially if they are at the level of investigator, initiator, or NIH type studies. But you also have clinical trial investigators. They may not be conducting NIH studies, but they will be helping pharmaceutical companies and device manufacturers to design clinical trials. And there's an opportunity for other individuals, whether they're clinical trial implementers or healthcare providers, to provide input in the form of advisory boards in terms of new clinical trials. There's then the healthcare providers who are, of course, a large group of individuals. The majority of them right now, according to the Institute of Medicine, are not conducting clinical trials. And then, of course, we have the general public or individuals, some of who are patients and some of who are part of the broader population. I put this slide in a pyramid just to show how it is important to look at opportunities to intersect and interface and increase part of our training opportunity to support clinical trials, especially as we look to address disparities. For example, with regards to the public, as shown on this slide, there's issues about awareness and information about clinical trials, the understanding about the informed consent process, and also understanding about being engaged about participation in clinical trials. Community practitioners, here we're looking at how do we introduce them to clinical trials without disrupting their practice, especially if we can tie to population health and some of what they're supposed to do as part of practice. And we'll have real examples of this as how we're addressing this problem. For the implementers and investigators, of course, some of these trainings are baked in already, conducted by NIH, by institutions, as well as by individuals who train folks for clinical trials. It is important to look at how we extend that training to individuals who are out in the community, and that's something that the Association of Black Cardiologists does very well. And of course, at the level of the academic researchers, as I mentioned, these guys are usually very well trained at the doctoral level, and they have to provide some of these resource and support to new clinical trial development. I just want to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of what's actually coming up as potential solutions. This is a TED presentation by Dr. Priscilla Pemu, who coined the phrase culturally congruent coaching. In this instance, she was sharing data that we conducted with a health community physicians network, as well as a big Bethel AME church, which is a large church in the Atlanta community that serves predominantly African-American patients. You'll see from a subsequent slide the impressive data that we received. And according to Dr. Pemu, a big part of this is understanding what it means to have a culturally congruent communication. What I want to mention before I leave this TED slide is that this information was so powerful. Within a period of 6 months, over 2 million people have actually downloaded and viewed this talk, and TED has actually transcribed it into over 24 languages, as well as featured the talk on their editor's page. And this tells us that this is an opportunity that a lot of people are looking for. It's a little bit of the data behind the TED Talk, and this has been published, as you see referenced. The key here that Dr. Pemu was emphasizing is that the intervention did lead over 36% of individuals to achieve 3 new self-management behaviors, as well as significant but variable change in their blood pressure, blood glucose, A1C, as well as exercise. And this is the actual data as you look at what happened with the glucose over time, the systolic blood pressure over time, and the exercise. Important to note here that individuals received the coaching intervention only for a period of 12 weeks, and then they were left on their own to go ahead and self-monitor and share their data. And so up to a year, there was continuing improvement and retention of the gains they made. Just want to point out that the participants were over 90% African-American. As you can see, the age range averaged 62. and almost half of them were over 65 years or older, 70% women, typical diabetic patient population with obesity, and 64% of them were obese, whereas 30% were overweight. So this led us to be thinking about the opportunity to integrate this into a research proposal or research opportunity that we've called Cardiovascular Implementation Study, sponsored by the Association of Black Cardiologists as well as the NIH. Before I leave that, this slide is just summarizing some of what we've learned. We've had over 400 African-American patients that have been studied. As I said, they've been able to sustain some of the clinical gains. The references are shown here in the various manuscripts that have been published. It is important to note, again, that patients do the monitoring, they share their information, and they get feedback from their providers as well as coaches. The other really exciting thing that's currently under review for publication is Dr. Pemu has joined up with an individual who has an expertise on using natural language processing to evaluate what we call the culture of health. And according to the data so far, the diabetic patients who received health coaching using the platform, they were able to experience different behavior goals achieved. And it seemed like the coach participant dyad was important. In other words, there was better performance when there was congruency between the coaches and the participants. So a female-female dyad potentially indicates some cultural awareness, and cultural sort of representation that allow the communication to go well. And so this is going to be an opportunity for future research about the role of culturally congruent communication in understanding how individuals respond to participation in clinical research as well as behavior improvement in the context of practice and quality of care. Just to turn our attention a little bit to the CIVIS that I mentioned earlier, which is the Cardiovascular Implementation Study. This has been going on for some time now, launched back in April 2016. Represented here are individuals, leaders from the Association of Black Cardiologists who have made a commitment to be a part of this study. Junker Bull, who was at the time FDA Commissioner for the Office of Minority Health at FDA, supported our initial launch of the program. We have published the manuscript on the baseline for this particular study. As you can see, we have funding from NIH to actually implement an early registry, which would bring data from electronic medical records. And these are the participants in the Vanguard. There are 12 cardiology sites that are involved. Just to mention very quickly, the registry has two sides to it. There is a patient-facing side, which allows patients to use the technology to self-monitor their health, as I have shared, and also share the data with the coach. As you can see here, the coaches can communicate with the participants either remotely or in person. And these days, a lot of this communication is being done remotely. The other side of it is what happens with the electronic medical records. We're able to bring the data into the platform. And as you can see, it is agnostic in terms of the EMR. It could be eClinical, Epic, Cerner, Athena Health. What happens is the EMR has to be FHIR compliant, FHIR. This is a protocol that the NIH is very much promoting in order to have some standardization to how data is collected and shared. I will say that for us, with the CIVIS, we have an opportunity to focus attention on various diseases based on what the community has a big interest in. So with the Association of Black Cardiologists, as you can see, we have a lot of cardiovascular issues like heart failure, AFib, sickle cell, and systemic lupus that we have an interest in, but also recently this year, COVID-19. So based on how the data is pulled in, we have the capacity to customize the questions that we ask. I want to mention that an important part of our effort here is what we call front door consent process. This is a way, because we do have the data gathered, we can actually do bulk consent where people have the opportunity to opt out. If they do not, we will be able to reach out to them when we have protocols. This is very important for small practices to be able to bring in research opportunities. Finally, we do have with CIVIS the opportunity to integrate social determinants. It's a key part of why the registry is being launched. And in this case, we have a big initiative that NIH has rolled out called FinX that has a toolkit that allows us to customize how we gather the social determinants, but it does have a baseline of how that data is gathered. That essentially allows us to join with others who are collecting large data sets. And we are quite excited about this because that means beyond CIVIS, we can actually begin to ask important questions, especially when we have enough tens of thousands of patients within our registry, as well as that can communicate with other NIH funding, because that would allow us to ask questions such as related to artificial intelligence, and very much excited about collaboration with Eric Topol in this regard. I just want to round up here by just spending a little bit of time on maternal mortality. This is an area that obviously is critical for African-American women. And again, this painting is reflective of some of our turmoil that we've experienced this summer in terms of what happens to Black lives after the mother birthed them. And of course, we're recognizing here based on this Time magazine, that sometimes the road is rough as these children die unnecessarily, sometimes from police brutality. In terms of the maternal mortality itself, I'm very proud that the Association of Black Cardiologists sponsored the Maternal Mortality Heart Health Roundtable, which again, Dr. Rachel Bond, I know, will speak to. But the important thing here is it does allow us to begin to focus attention and resources on this major issue of Black women dying during childbirth. At Morehouse School of Medicine and the state of Georgia, we are implementing what is called the Georgia Improve. My colleagues, Dr. Cheryl Franklin, OBGYN, and Dr. Natalie Hernandez, who is a social epidemiologist, behavioral health expert, are rolling this out through funding from our CTSA. And again, the important thing about this is it is gathering the data in a very purposeful way, using technology, using remote monitoring, and reaching out to these women, and we will be able to build on this foundation going forward. So to conclude, when we look at women CV research progress, pitfalls, and promise, we can obviously take heart that both the National Institutes of Health as a sponsor, the FDA as a regulator, have established guidelines for the inclusion of women and minorities in clinical research and clinical trials. Significant barriers remain, however, because the studies are going on and many of them still do not have enough minorities represented and women represented. As recommended by the IOM, a new model of pragmatic point of care research provides an opportunity to engage and train new practitioners as well as the patients and communities they serve. This is the model that we're embarking on with the CIVIS ABC Cardiovascular Implementation Study. The role of technology for patient engagement, electronic data capture, and data platforms, especially using standardization that protects the health data, are evolving concepts to bolster practice infrastructure. And these technology platforms are a part of the ABC Cardiovascular Implementation Study and the Georgia Improved Maternal Mortality, which are promising models that we will continue to pursue and deliver with publications. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to our panel and question and answer session.